without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Sayal Sandeep from IHS Markit.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, good day, everybody. I guess when we make these presentations regarding IMO, usually within a couple of minutes, questions start coming from the audience. So hopefully we have 6 or 7 minutes, at least in my case, to kind of run through my slides. But feel free to ask us questions later. In fact, we have already seen some of the questions, so I'll try to answer them as we go through the presentation. So if you had to take 2 really quick takeaways from our discussions, one is what Blake said this morning, which is scramble, which is, and I'll rephrase it to say mad scramble starting in 2020. And then the second takeaway is really uncertainty in this shipping and refining industry as we move towards the IMO spec change. And I think some of this will start making sense once we talk about this. So just to recap for folks who have not kept up with this topic, last year after IMO finished their study, they had used an external contractor to complete their study. They made the decision in October of 2016 that they're going to stay with the original implementation date of January 1, 2020 to reduce the sulfur spec down to 0.58% sulfur. So we think this is going to have a huge global impact on both the shipping and the refining industry. So as Blake had also mentioned earlier in the morning, although fuel sulfur specifications have been reduced over the last many, many years, this is going to have a bigger impact because you have the sheer volume of 4 million barrels per day of bunker fuel that we have to convert to the lower sulfur 0.5% sulfur spec starting in 2020. And this is going to have an impact not only on the shipping industry, as I said, and also on the refining industry and all these other consultants and value chain suppliers who support these 2 industries over the next 3 to 5 year period. So the big question is really, can you make this 0.5% sulfur fuel? And the answer is really, you can make this sulfur spec, contrary to a lot of other discussions that are out in the public domain today. The bigger question and the bigger challenge is, what do you do with the 3.5% residual fuel and the surplus residual fuel, and how do you get rid of that? So both the shipping industry and the refining industry are going to react to these regulations. Let's focus first on the shipping industry, and then we'll talk about how the refining industry is going to potentially react during the same time frame. So there are 4 options that the shipping industry is going to use in order to meet the requirements. The first option is really the use of scrubbers, and I'm sure most of you have heard about this. So the ships can install scrubbers, and they can continue using the 3.5%, the higher sulfur spec that they're using, a fuel that they're using currently. But what's happening is we have got close to 120,000 vessels out there in the marketplace today. Out of those 120,000 vessels, 30,000 vessels use all the bunker fuel that we're talking about here, the 4 million barrels per day that I mentioned. And out of those 30,000, 20,000 really use 80% of that fuel. So it's really a 80-20 rule, but 20,000 is a pretty big number of ships that you have to address or install scrubbers. If you look at the current market landscape of scrubber adoption, there are close to 400 ships, maybe 450 ships as of last count that have installed scrubbers. And these are the smaller vessels like cruise lines, which probably they might be a little bigger in size. But the remaining 40 to 50% of the adoption has been done by these roll-on, roll-off small ferries that are operating in the e-com markets currently. So it's not a big significant impact at this point in time. The the shipping industry do not have an economic incentive to install a scrubber at this point in time. The cost of the scrubbers range from anywhere from $1 million, $2 million, to all the way to maybe $7 or $8 million, depending on the size of the ship. So between now and 2020, we expect the rate of adoption is going to be very, very slow. And then once 2020 comes around, we expect the pace of adoption to really kick on from after that time period. The second option, alternative, is LNG. And we think that LNG is not going to be a significant adoption pathway that the ship industry is going to follow. And there are many reasons around it. One is lack of infrastructure, the cost of LNG itself, the loss of cargo space on those ships if you have to install LNG as the fuel. And then the only place where we expect LNG to be used is in smaller vessels, the vessels or ships that move between small short-haul points from point-to-point routes and which need frequent bunkering operations. And if you look at the 2020 time frame, we expect LNG to have maybe 1 or 2% of the global impact of penetration at that point in time. So not a big number. The third option is the ship industry will obviously use the 0.5% sulfur fuel, which is the new specification that goes into effect in the year 2020. And we'll talk a little bit more about this compliance pathway in just a minute. The fourth compliance pathway is really non-compliance, or in simpler terms, cheating. So essentially, ships will continue using the 3.5% sulfur and have no scrubbers installed on those ships. This is probably one of the biggest unknowns that the industry is facing. And when I say industry, it's both the refining industry, the shipping industry, trying to figure out what the non-compliance is. We expect the non-compliance to be approximately 15%, 15%, which includes both sanctioned non-compliance and also unsanctioned non-compliance. So the questions are many. How's IMO going to police it? How are they going to enforce it? There are a lot of questions around this, and even with the recent meetings that they had 2 weeks ago, the consensus is that they're going to stay with the 2020 forecast period, but they have no clear idea of how this new regulation is going to be enforced. So we expect this subcommittee that's been put in place by the IMO to continue working on this over the next many months to come up with an enforcement schedule that, obviously at IHS Markit and other consultants are keeping on top of. So before I go through this chart, just a little bit of background on, what we think the refining industry is going to do. The refining industry is going to respond, although they haven't really taken any significant steps in that direction. So even though the bunker fuel, which is that 4 million barrels per day, comprises of close to 4 to 5% of the total refined product demand, this is a portion which is very, very difficult to process, and it's very expensive to process, as we all know. This is really the bottom of the barrel product that you're talking about. We expect a huge pull on distillates, or the middle distillate barrel that's going to be used to make the 0.5% sulfur fuel, which is the new on-spec sulfur fuel starting in 2020. The crude runs are expected to go up. Our forecasts show that the crude runs in the year 2020 and some in 2021 will go up by approximately 600 to 700 to 800,000 barrels per day, partly to make the distillates for this 0.5 sulfur fuel, and also to make other blend stocks and feedstocks and intermediates in order to meet the demand at that point in time. The refiners will also react by creating these new formulations. They're going to pull upon all these light sweet, heavier sweet crude feedstocks and intermediate feedstocks in order to make the 0.5% sulfur fuel. The huge pull on distillates, as I said, even we expect the VGO to come out of the cat cracker streams in many countries and refineries in order for it to go as a blend stock into this 0.5% sulfur fuel. So various components are going to move into this new specification in order to meet the regulations. So it's a pretty long and tough task, as you can see, even from the refinery perspective, because once you take the VGO out of the FCC crackers, you're talking about FCC cracker economics. And I'm going to talk briefly about the pricing impacts in just a minute. So refiners have to make the decision, are we going to play in this bunker market? And if we're going to play, how are we going to address this 4 million barrels per day of residual stream? And if they're going to make the decision on not playing in this market, what do we do with this excess residual stream? Do we sell it off to somebody? Do you go through an intermediary like a trading company, and then they take account of that appropriately? So those are questions different refineries are going to be asking. As I think most everybody at least probably agrees on, we do not think that there's enough conversion capacity. That means resid hydrocrackers, resid cat crackers, and definitely cokers in place by 2020 to destroy this high sulfur resid. There's not enough capacity in place. Even though the external contractor made that comment and part of their thesis was that there's enough conversion capacity, we have done a very deep dive and we keep on top of all the probable projects that are coming about in the public domain, and we don't think there's enough conversion capacity to address this 3.5 to 4 million barrels per day of residual fuel. So just to kind of paint the picture of what the refineries will be looking at this point in time. So we expect the surplus resid to go into the power market, and I'll come up with a calculation here in just a minute. So moving back to the slide, this shows a global resid balance. This number that you see, the blue bar, and I'm going to move from left to right on this chart. The total barrels that we're looking at is approximately 3.3 million barrels per day. And if you add 20 to 25% of cutter stock, like light cycle oil, middle distillate, that blenders and traders use today and refiners use today, the total balance is approximately 4 million barrels per day of total residual fuel demand. So this 3.3 million is where we're starting off with. We expect, as I mentioned before, additional crude runs of approximately 700,000 barrels per day in the 2020 time period. And what that's going to do is that's going to help in producing more distillates to meet this 0.5% sulfur fuel, but it's also going to bring additional resid into the balance. So that's the red bar that you see, which is creation, as I call it. Then we have accounted for all the new conversion capacity, as I was mentioning, between now and 2020. And you just got 2.5, 3 years to go before this regulation comes into being. And taking into account conversion capacity for cokers, resid hydrocrackers, and also resid cat crackers, and then also taking into account any incremental capacity creep by increasing utilization, and taking into account some things like, adding auto deheading valves, etc., which improves the efficiency and the length time on coking units. We expect the residue to be destroyed by these three bars that you see here. 2 bars that you see here. We expect a little bit more of the resid to go into the asphalt market over and above the base demand that we usually forecast during this time period. But a major chunk of this 3.5 million barrels per day is going to stay in the residual pool. Most of it is going to stay in the 0.5% pool, as I've been talking about, with new blend stocks that are going to be used. It could be, as I said, VGO feedstocks. It's going to be sweeter atmospheric residues that will go directly into this 0.5% pool. We could expect other ultra-low sulfur feedstocks, intermediates, that also could go into this 0.5 sulfur pool to make this 0.5 sulfur volume that you see here. And then these are the two that account for the sulfur, the bunker pool that will stay as 3.5% sulfur that you're used to seeing today. You get 500,000 barrels sitting in ships which have installed scrubbers in 2020. And then the non-compliance that I was talking about, it's approximately 15%. That's 600,000 barrels per day of total fuel oil demand. That will be under a non-compliance scenario that you see here. But having taken into account increase in crude runs, addition of capacities, and maybe some mothballing of capacities, although it's a bad time for any refinery to do that, but you're now in 2020, as we know, and then also taking into account any changes in demands of bunker fuel, we expect a surplus of approximately 400,000 barrels per day of residual fuel that will make its way into the power market. We have looked at approximately 70 countries and actually sprinkled this 400,000 barrels across those 70 countries. And those countries essentially currently use fuel oil as a feedstock for generating power. What we're seeing is that they've got some spare utilization capacity, and by moving this product into that market, they're going to increase the utilization for that 1 or 2 or 3 year period, depending on what the enforcement schedule comes out to be. We are not saying that this is going to go into the supply chain of coal, but essentially it's going to be on current existing fuel oil power plants where the utilization will be increased. So what this does to the pricing is we expect, since the surplus barrel and the incremental barrel, as we know, incremental economics, the pricing is going to be based on coal parity pricing, which is really going to dictate the scramble that I'm just going to talk about in terms of the pricing impact. So with all these changes, all the fundamental changes that we're talking about, and there are many unknowns and many assumptions, as I've tried to explain in this short presentation of mine, we expect a significant impact on both the product prices and also the crude and the refinery margins. We expect distillate cracks to get very strong. We expect the light-heavy differentials to blow out to anywhere from $60 to $70 a barrel during the 2020 timeframe. And the reason is because the high sulfur fuel oil is going to be priced at coal parity or thermal parity to coal. And because of the huge pull on distillates, distillates are going to be very highly priced, and that's where the distillate cracks get stronger. So you see this whole blowout between the light, and then the heavy differential during that time frame. The lights and the sour fuel oil differentials are expected to widen also during the same time frame, which will manifest itself in the widening of the light and sour, sweet and sour crude differentials. So it's going to have a pretty much a connected effect on all of these pieces. I don't have a chart on prices. I can obviously answer any questions you have after this. But on a final note, so there are going to be some winners and there are going to be some losers. The winners are going to be the refineries who have deep conversion units already in place, and most of the Gulf Coast refiners definitely have those, as we know, and also in some of the other regions that we can talk about offline. But those guys are going to come out pretty good during this time frame. They're going to see extremely strong margins because they're going to be destroying this cheap resid that I've been talking about in their conversion units. The sweet cracking refineries also will get some reprieve. For folks who have heard us in CIRA Week and AFPM and other presentations, we talk about rationalization in Europe. We expect close to 2 million barrels per day of refinery shutdown over the next 10 to 15 years. We think that that whole continental complex will have some reprieve over the next 4 to 5 years because the sweeter refineries, they'll continue to run their sweeter crudes, and that sweeter resid is going to be quite valuable during this time frame to make the 0.5% sulfur fuel. And the refineries that are going to be under pressure and significantly under pressure, one is the simpler refineries that run heavy sour crudes because they'll be making this resid, which has no place to go except for the power market on an incremental basis. And then the cracking refineries that also run sour crudes, they will be under pressure during this time frame. So, I've said quite a few different things in terms of what the shippers are going to do, what the refiners are going to do. A lot of uncertainty. The scramble period starts in 2020. And as we know, there are not enough investments in place currently for them to make any transition at this point in time. So I'll turn it over to Bob again, and feel free to shoot us your questions later.
So one of the points he made that I wanted to amplify is sanctioned non-compliance. We're already seeing some countries saying in their investment plan for the refineries they need time. So we'll see what this compliance committee does with that, in addition to the unsanctioned. As far as your comments, I still do want those in writing. So as you listen through this session here, if you have some more, please take them. When we finish going down our group of panelists, we'll start working our way through the questions, but I forgot to tell you, please put them in writing and we'll do them the same way. Thank you. Rashid.
Sandeep, that was a great presentation and a number of takes from there, which I'll use. Basically, when we go out and talk to the refineries, we hear three things. Problems starting in 2020. How do we get rid of a residue? Number two is how can I benefit from this opportunity? And the third thing is it going to happen in 2020, or would be a staggered move to 0.5? So do I have 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to react to it? And I'm going to talk about the refineries, what they are doing, what they should be doing, and their considerations in making decisions. Essentially, if we take today, refineries are blending their atmospheric bottoms, vacuum bottoms, other residues with distillates, other light, low sulfur streams to make a bunker or high sulfur fuel oil. Right now, capped at 3.5 weight %. Now, come 2020, how do they make a decision? Or even today, how do they make decision for 2020? The main question is, can they somehow make some of their product into 0.5 weight % sulfur? bunker, take the advantage of price difference between low sulfur bunker and high sulfur bunker. And that is dependent on the existing tools they have in the refinery, their configuration, and what crudes do they process. And then the outlets, if they take the resid, convert it into lighter products, can they sell it? Other decision is, and a number of refineries are debating it, is to exit the bunker market completely. Some refiners can do it. For them, it might make sense. But the other refiners, on the other hand, their main business is bunker. They cannot afford to walk away and then make distillates and survive, because then competition catches them. So their decision would depend on how can they make 0.5 of 8% bunker. Other thing that the refiners consider is what is coming down the road. Is 0.5 the final number? And they invest billions of dollars to meet that? Or do they have to think about the next step? Just like for gasoline and diesel, every 5-10 years there was a change in spec. Would there be another spec change in another 5-10 years? How do they react? Would they have stranded capital? So all these considerations go into decision on what to do next. So if we take just the residues, distillates can always be sold out, so I've just taken the residue stream. How can they convert that into a low sulfur bunker or distillates or low sulfur fuel oil? As you mentioned, one of the outlets, which is for, in some cases, is send more resid into asphalt market. The other option is more resid into power. And there are other industries like steel and and cement making, which can use high sulfur fuels without detrimental effect. So can they transfer it to them? But the bulk, and these are all small bunker users or fuel oil users, bulk of the resid would end up in the refinery and they'll have to convert it. So the options would depend on your configuration, your product market, what can you sell, and what you want to do. So if we look at a coking option, coke basically, a coker takes the bottom, converts it into naphthas and distillates, removes all the residue. The residue portion is concentrated as petroleum coke. And some refiners are looking at what to do with that petroleum coke. And one answer is using a CFB boilers, convert it to steam and power. And within the refinery, now you have a total solution. The problem is with this that what you make would be primarily a gas oil distillate-based bunker oil. And still, the question that is being asked is, what would be the impact of gas oil distillate-based bunker oil or bunker fuels on ships engines? And there are questions that there may be a reliability issue there. So they have to look at it, balance it, and do you send all of your stream to coker? Can you do a coker plus crude substitution? So that's an option. But with coker, it is a proven scheme. It permits you to easily adjust to the market conditions. If there is more demand for distillate or gasolines, you can make that. If there is a more demand for bunkers, you can take advantage of it. So it gives you flexibility. And then by converting coke, you get rid of all the bottoms. The number two thing is resid hydrotreating. And that gives you a resid which is low sulfur, but it's a complex, more expensive process. You can take ATBs and VTBs into a resid hydrotreater, multiple reactors, mostly high pressure services, high maintenance, but it does give you a low sulfur treated product, which can be blended with other streams to increase the sulfur up to 5,000 ppm, which is 0.5 weight percent. It maintains the total bunker that the refinery is producing. The third is resid hydrocracking. You can do different rates of conversion by putting in resid hydrocracking. So again, you have a flexibility as to how much distillates you want to make and how much bunker one wants to make. Depending on the processes you use and the conversion of the residue, it is likely that the unconverted oil from these processes would require further hydroprocessing to meet 0.58% sulfur spec. Most of these resid hydrocrackers would be either ebulated bed or slurry phase hydrocrackers, expensive, high pressure units. And then the last one, technology that comes to mind is RFCC. RFCC, depending on the crude oil processing, can be used for converting residue. The slurry oils that are left would have to be hydrotreated and then disposed of in the bunker market. The issue is, because of the higher conversion, your total bunker production will go down. So again, is a market situation. Does it make sense to make more gasoline and distillates in place of bunker? Now, there are other technologies which are in use in refineries. Many refiners have those, so it always makes sense to take full advantage of your existing tool base. So if you look at SDA process, solvent deasphalting, deep cut vacuums, whiz breakers, these technologies, if they exist, can be used to reduce the new investment if done properly. The next thing I want to do is take a very simple refinery. I didn't put any numbers for the reason because I don't have a very specific refinery with crude slate in mind. But a simple topping refinery with a gasoline units, distillate units, a crude and a vacuum unit with all the bottoms ending up in bunker or high sulfur fuel oil or road asphalt is a refinery which I think you said is an endangered species. How would they make money? We think come 2020, there would be a major price difference between high sulfur and low sulfur bunkers. So if you do not convert your residue would get the same value of close to coal values. Many refineries may not be able to survive. In order to do that, to get out of that, I think the simpler approach that we talked about is a coker with a CFB. Essentially what you're doing is you're using the bottom of the barrel to make distillates and the power for the refinery. And you're using all of your crude. It also allows you to completely exit the bunker value, the bunker market, or HS, high sulfur fuel oil markets. Again, the distillates you make, how much you send to the crude, it's a case-by-case analysis. In some cases, you may be able to make some low sulfur bunker and distillate. It gives you ability to adjust to the markets. All told, I think with this flexibility, refineries should be able to improve their margin. But the main question is, time is running out. Would they be able to get this done, even a coker and CFB by 2020? And there are people looking at it. They are looking at completing it towards the end of 2020, end of 2021. So there are lots of considerations going on that we know of right now. Now, if you have other existing units, again, RDS unit, RFCCs, hydrocracker, whizbreaker, SDA, many Asian refineries have RDS units. Many European refineries, particularly those which sell high sulfur fuel oils, have whizbreaker assets. There are RDS units in Asia, RFCC, and SDA units sprinkled all over the place. Again, we have to look at the configuration, but looking at all those things, the bottom line is a refiner has to convert the bottom of the barrel to make it profitable. And again, we think coker would be the option, which would work for most of the refineries. That's what I had. Any questions, we'll ask later on. Scott?
Thank you. I, for one, vote for going back to 2025. So as a longtime refining technology guy, I look at this from the refining business perspective, and the dilemma to me for refiners comes down to two questions. One, do I want to make fuel oil and actually desulfurize it and remain in a declining market? Or do I want to actually convert it into something more valuable? I mean, that's been the justification for all of the refining bottom-of-the-barrel projects that I've been involved in over the last 3.5 decades. You know, we're looking as a business to make higher value products, to have positive margins. In a lot of places, that means road diesel. In some places, that's diesel and gasoline. Marine diesel, obviously, is a variation on the distillate theme, and in some cases, even looking at petrochemical feedstocks. When we look at upgrading of the residue, you know, the market tends to dictate, right? There's obviously an uncertain market for fuel oil, both in terms of demand and for pricing. And the fact is that, you know, if we can't get the pricing, it's not going to justify actually making it as a product. There's more and more availability of opportunity crudes, both light and heavy, with a broad range of properties, which gives refiners more flexibility in the choice of feedstocks they run and the product slates that they make. Again, you know, looking at trying to increase the value of the products coming out of the refinery. Traditionally, light transportation fuels, gasoline and diesel in particular, are desired relative to fuel oil. And when we increase look at the global increase in demand for both of these relative to fuel oil, that just drives the decision making in the refiner's perspective. And ultimately, it's about refining margins. You know, how do we make money? Now, if I look globally, the markets where you have the highest fuel oil production are not in the U.S. We have the highest conversion refineries in the world. So they tend to be in Europe, the Far East, and in South America. And fuel oil is today still one of the highest value products, highest produced products out of the refinery, but not necessarily the highest value. When you look at residue conversion today and the technologies employed, the non-catalytic versions are still the dominant versions. Coking is the most widely used. Visp braking, even though it's mild conversion, is still very widely used. And that's consistent with a lot of these worldwide markets doing visp braking for fuel oil production. Others like resid catalytic cracking, resid hydroprocessing, and solvent deasphalting do contribute, but they're smaller players in today's market. When you look at the options, Rashid touched on a number of these already. There are a variety of ways that we can attack this problem, especially if we're looking at converting the residue. We can do residue hydrotreating, residue FCC, solvent deasphalting, delayed coking, various forms of residue hydrocracking like ebulated bed and slurry phase, gasification, and ultimately combination of processes. And I think even though all of these have various pros and cons, and the pros and cons vary with specific applications, I think the answer is, from a refining perspective, I don't want to make heavy fuel oil. Whether it's low sulfur or high sulfur, I want to turn it into something else. So I want to convert this resid, and I'm going to be using more likely a combination of these processes to accomplish that objective. So it may be solvent deasphalting in combination with delayed coking or resid hydrotreating, or others, with resid catalytic cracking. The fact is that while coking has traditionally been the number one conversion process for residues, I think we're going to see more creativity going forward. While I think it'll continue to be part of the solution, it won't necessarily be the only solution. If you look at resid desulfurization, and a couple of these guys have already touched on it, the biggest problem is it doesn't do much in the way of conversion. You're still making fuel oil, which is a lower value product by definition than the other lighter transportation fuels. It's a high pressure process. It requires a lot of catalyst, frequently changed out catalyst. You have to manage things like metals and other impurities. It's not a low investment for low conversion. It really has no significant impact on the overall average product value coming out of the refinery, unless, of course, you can imagine low sulfur fuel oil coming up to a price consistent with low sulfur diesel. Probably not likely. Even if there are spikes in the short term, I don't see that being a long-term solution. And basically, even after you've hydrotreated the residue, you still have to use valuable low sulfur distillates for blending for viscosity. So you're now downgrading a higher value product for a lower value product. And you're still producing bunker fuel. So to me, I don't see a refiner putting in a high capital cost and a high operating cost unit for what would be getting a larger share of a declining market and ultimately ending up with a stranded investment. So from my perspective, the answer is you're going to convert the residue. Now, if you're not already doing a project today, it's not likely that you're going to be on stream in time for 2020. But the fact is that while residue conversion increases the refinery complexity and it's a significant capital investment, it is the one investment that can consistently deliver a positive economic return because it's improving the overall value of the products out of the refinery. And I do show a picture of a delayed coking unit there because even today it is the most widely used residue conversion process for a reason. It's not catalytic, and because of the nature of residues, they're difficult to convert catalytically. The thermal nature of coking allows it to handle the widest range of feedstocks and convert the residue completely. While 25 to 30% shows up as coke, you still have 70 to 75% that shows up as lighter products that are better quality than the starting feed. And with that, we'll move on to our concluding remarks and try to open this up for further discussion with the audience.
Good morning. My name is Phil Steed, since Scott forgot to mention that. And my remarks this morning are primarily focused on trying to provide a framework in which to start thinking about how refiners are going to respond to the IMO 2020 requirement. So the first thing I think about is, what's the refiner's point of view when we start thinking about reducing the sulfur content of marine fuels? And there are lots of ways, as we've heard, to make this product. But for most refiners, it's going to be a shift from using high sulfur resid and some amount of cutter stock to make 3.5% sulfur fuel oil, to a combination of mostly low sulfur gas oil and a quantity of resid. If you look at it from that perspective, it's obvious that the demand for low sulfur distillates is going to increase in order to make the base stock for the 0.5 sulfur IMO fuel. And the other thing that happens, which is kind of a sea change for the industry, is an important outlet for high sulfur resids declines significantly. And so there's going to be a lot of rebalancing in the market that has to take place. And this is going to be complicated and very uncertain. I'll point out that Blake this morning made that comment that during that shakeout period around 2020, things are going to be pretty exciting. And I concur with that point of view. The rebalancing is going to require, well, first, ship owners and operators are going to have to make some choices about how they will operate, what marine fuels they'll use, whether or not they use scrubbers, whether or not they convert to LNG. And because of the increased demand for low sulfur distillates, there are going to be new gas oil desulfurization capacity added. We'll have to find new outlets for the for resid, high sulfur resid, and likely there will be new upgrading capacity added. And then I threw in the wild card of technological innovation. There is always the possibility that someone will come up with a great way to produce this product at a much lower cost. Now, given that we've been making refined products for a long time now, I'm not sure that there's a wild card out there, but you never know. So refiners are going to face some tough choices. Will prices and demand ultimately support the investments that they need to make? And as others have alluded to this morning, can a simple refinery with no resid upgrading capability really survive in this coming environment? So there's a lot going on here, and not very much of it is certain. But there are a few pricing effects that, at least directionally, we can predict. Marine fuel is going to become more expensive, which will have impacts on shippers. Resid will definitely become less valuable, having impacts on refiners. The crude price will be significantly affected as these other changes in refined products take place. Obviously, the lighter, sweeter crudes will become more valuable than the heavier, high sulfur crudes, and as a consequence, the light-heavy differential between those crudes will widen. And the impact on other products is not clear at this time. There will be the need to run more crude oil in order to produce the incremental distillate for IMO fuel oil. And so that will mean there's additional products being produced, and that will put some, will influence the product markets for other refined products. Clearly, this is a major change in refinery operations. The desulfurization loads are going to be much higher with concerns about hydrogen capacity and sulfur plant capacity. Cokers are going to be running flat out to maximize the disposal of the high sulfur resid. So it sounds to me like there will be some winners and some losers as we implement this new rule. Deep conversion refineries definitely have the potential of higher margins as they can convert the lower valued high sulfur resid. Cracking refineries are likely, in my opinion, to see margins decline unless they can find suitable outlets for high sulfur resid that they produce. So that's kind of a summary of many of the things that we have discussed this morning, and hopefully that gives us a little bit of a framework to have further questions. So I will turn it back over to Bob to field those questions.
Very good. So we've rephrased half a dozen. If you have any more already written out, please raise your hand and my colleagues will collect them. I'm going to start with a question from Kirk Novak at Markit. Is the preference by the regulators to have the low sulfur fuel or to allow ships to run high sulfur feedstocks with exhaust treating technologies? So I thought I'd ask my IHS colleague here about preferences by regulators.
I think the preference from regulators are, if you take EPA as an example, the effort is always going to be reducing sulfur or any of these bad actors. So the emphasis really from the IMO is also to reduce the sulfur on the residual fuel from the source. I mean, that's really the recommendation, or that's probably the assumption or the hope to reduce the emissions. Because there are other issues that are being talked about, which is NOx emissions, which IMO is trying to address in the near future. There's GHG emissions as part of the Paris Accord, and so on and so forth. So scrubbers, they understand that scrubbers will be one of the compliance pathways, but their effort is really trying to reduce the sulfur from the source.
Thank you. Next question is from Stephen Sims of the Houston Technology Center. Reducing sulfur in gasoline and diesel involved direct sulfur removed from the fuel. Reducing sulfur in fuel oil requires changing the fuel by removing vacuum bottoms. What will be the leading, most economic way to accomplish this? The short answer is it depends. I'm going to let Phil elaborate a bit more on how do you decide what is the most economical option. Phil?
Yes, of course, the most economical option will be a function of your specific situation. Right. So you're going to have to evaluate the relative costs of separating the high sulfur resid and the hydrotreating of vacuum gas oil. Clearly, you can also look at the option of resid hydrotreating, but that's a typically more expensive option than VGO hydrotreating. So it will just ultimately depend on how the process works and interacts with the rest of your refinery and the relative investments to give you the higher return.
Phil, thank you. Our next question is from Carlos Fernando at Petrobras, who asks, what is the most promising technology for treating heavy fuel oils in order to lower maritime sulfur emissions? That kind of prejudges that treating fuel oil is what you're going to do. But I'm going to ask Scott to take a crack at How do you pick a winner?
I'll take a crack at this and further just comment that I don't see residue hydrotreating being a long-term solution. Right. If you look at the operating units today, most of them are atmospheric resid hydrotreaters. Well, what is atmospheric resid? It's VGO plus vacuum resid. So you're basically already hydrotreating both of those streams. And if you take the VGO out and just do the VAC resid, well, there's a host of issues with the process trying to get down to really low sulfur with vacuum resid feedstocks. It's a highly complex feed. The sulfur's difficult to get out. Getting it down to 0.5 sulfur in a lot of these, heavy crudes is an extreme challenge with, like I said, very little conversion, and you're still making a heavy product. I think that what we're going to see going ahead is more and more conversion of resid. It'll be a combination of coking, SDA plus resid hydrocracking, and it'll be residue destruction.
Thank you. Ben Gonzalez from Phillips 66 asked, do you expect fuel oil power producers to use high sulfur fuel oil if they're already using fuel with lower sulfur? And I'll ask Rashid to take that one.
I think that's a good question. It depends on what those power suppliers or power producers have installed. If they have emission control technologies installed, then they may be able to they will take benefit of the lower priced high sulfur fuel oils. If they don't and they have to install those technologies, then it's an economic evaluation. Does it make sense to invest in those technologies and take benefit of the lower cost high sulfur fuel oil? I think the decision is very similar to what the ship owners would be making. Do they go to scrubbers or do they go to low sulfur fuel oil? It's a long-term solution.
Next question is from John Gordon with Field Upgrading. How will the crude slate in the US Gulf Coast change in 2020? Will more heavy oil be brought in to take advantage of existing capacity? My colleague from IHS.
As Blake had also shown, our crude production profile. Essentially, shale oil is going to still be a pretty big player as part of the total mix in the U.S. I think one thing to keep in mind is the Gulf Coast refiners, especially the Gulf Coast refiners, are sitting on some complex assets. So they're going to continue to import the high sulfur crude oils to make the products, including the residual fuel products. We do not really significantly see a major shift because they've got the hardware to really process any kind of crude, definitely the sweet crudes. With the investments they made recently, but definitely they're focused on running the cheaper, heavier barrel as much as possible and use their conversion units to upgrade it to light value products.
We only have time for about one more question, and I'm going to take it from one of Scott's colleagues here. Joe Woodson of Amec Foster Wheeler notes, the availability of coke buyers is often understated. I think he means petroleum coke. And there are perceptions that coke is generally hard to get rid of. How does IMO change, if at all, the robust market for pet coke?
So I think Joe already knows the answer to this question, and he's probably just checking to see if I know the answer too. So when we look at the pet coke market, it's something on the order of 120 million tons a year worldwide, and it continues to be a robust market used for a variety of uses. I think that, if anything, we're going to see more residue conversion, and we'll see more coke generation, over the next 5 to 10 years. So, if anything, the pet coke market is going to stay robust.
Good. Well, first thing I want to do in closing is ask for a round of applause for our panelists.